Hello everyone, my name is Jean Perrochon. I'm the commercial director in charge of the Forum de l'Investissement Hôtelier Africain, also known under the acronym FIHA. I would like to welcome you to this first FIHA webinar in a series to inform our hospitality and tourism stakeholder community and to provide a regular update on the investor climate at this challenging time. In ordinary time, we would today and tomorrow have the pleasure of listening to our speakers and moderator in the flesh at our hotel investment conference and exhibition in Côte d'Ivoire's thriving capital, Abidjan. But times have demanded a different approach, and having forced us to postpone this much awaited regional event until the 7th and 9th of July, we are grateful to our panelists and moderator for agreeing to share their valued thoughts and their expertise with us today on this virtual platform, so thank you. Please rest assured that a recorded version of this webinar will be available to our registered audience soon afterwards. There are a few practical details I would like to highlight to our listeners before handing the session over to our speakers. Please be aware that only our speakers will have the ability to use their microphones in order to be heard. Some time will be set aside to answer questions from our audience. If you'd like to submit a question, please ensure that you click the Q&A button, and this is important. That's the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Do not post your questions in the chat window, please. We will try to answer as many questions as we have time for during the session. If it is not possible to answer them all today, we will aim to do so before the end of the week. Now, finally, please be aware that the recorded session will be made available on YouTube and on social media channels. We encourage you to share it with your network. I would now like to hand the reins over to our moderator, FABIO NAVA, who is Vice President of Capital Markets in the Hotels and Hospitality Group for Sub-Saharan Africa at commercial real estate services firm JLL. Good afternoon, FABIO, and welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, John. Much appreciated, and welcome to everyone. So good afternoon, and thanks for joining the webinar session, where we look to discuss the impact that COVID-19 is having on the hospitality industry in Africa. It's no doubt influenced all of us that work in the hospitality and tourism industry, as well as other major sectors of the world economy. The impact will be felt on a global scale and is somewhat a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence. It certainly feels similar to the 2008 global financial crisis, but even just on an economic level, it is really affecting countries on a social level too. So tonight we have some great industry leaders joining us on the webinar that will give key insights into the industry and the impact that COVID-19 has already had on hotel performance in Africa, as well as liquidity challenges faced by owners and banks alike, and most importantly, to see how regional and international hotel operators are dealing with the crisis. So on that note, I'd like to introduce you to the speakers today, who include Claire FILLATRE, who is the Senior Investment Officer for Proparco, Christopher BLEZIRI, who's the Principal Investment Officer at West African Development Bank, Mossadegh Bali, the CEO of Azalea Hotels Group, OLAF SCHMIDT, Manager for Tourism Investments in Africa for the IFC, Ouest, who is the CEO of Kasada Capital Management, and Tom EMANUEL, who is the Director of STR based in London. In terms of the format, we would like to start off with Tom from STR, who will provide some current data on the COVID-19 crisis and to put this pandemic into perspective before we go into a discussion with each of the panelists, who will give us a 2 to 3 minute overview of how this has impacted their businesses and what is to be expected going forward during and post the pandemic. So Tom, if you can get us underway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabio, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for joining us. I'm just going to give a quick 5-minute overview of what we've seen so far in terms of the impact of COVID-19. Just to step back, the previous slides stated that STR, we won't advise on what you should do. We won't discuss prices, rates, etc. We'll tell you what has happened. So if I could just ask that you refrain from asking any questions in that regard as any questions may come in. So if we move forward now to the next slide, the global impact of COVID-19. And just to begin with, I'm going to look predominantly at China and also at Europe, as both of those regions are somewhat ahead of Africa in terms of the curve, as we'll see as we progress through the presentation. But what we see here initially is the occupancy by day for China, Europe, and Italy since the start of the COVID-19 outbreak. So as you can see here, from an occupancy perspective, Europe is about a month behind China, although Italy has now overtaken China in terms of actual occupancy declines per se, as you can see, below the 10% mark, and the rest of Europe is very much heading in that direction. Please note that the data I'm going to be presenting today is up until and including the 15th of March. We will be releasing some more recent data come tomorrow, actually, but this is the data that we have available thus far. So all markets moving very much south. And if we then advance the slide, we can see that this is not our forecast. I emphasize that, but this is a potential European scenario anyway of declines in occupancy of circa 90% effectively. If we can again move the slide please forward. And as was mentioned by Fabio in his introduction, we've been asked a lot about previous downturns, and this showcases rolling RevPAR percentage change on a 28-day basis from January of 07 through to January of 2020. And what we can see from a Chinese perspective initially, RevPAR significantly down. So if people are asking us, is it going to be as bad as 2008? Well, the answer we're generally giving at the moment is it's actually going to be a lot worse. As we can see, the RevPAR percentage change for China is significantly lower than the lowest trough of the global financial crisis. Now, Europe is slightly higher. We do have to bear in mind this was just during the first 1 or 2 weeks of the crisis in Europe. So that purple line will now be far more in line with where the Chinese line is. So significantly worse off than we were during the financial crisis. And then if we advance the slide, please, you'll see again that actually occupancy in Europe, just at the very beginning of this crisis, was already lower than the trough of the global financial crisis. So putting it into quite stark terms, already the declines that we've seen. If we can just advance the slide, please. I've spent a lot of the last couple of weeks talking about the negatives, obviously. But the good news is we are starting to now see some green shoots of recovery in China. And I think this is really important to say. So what we've got here is the number of cases of COVID-19 versus the actual occupancy in China. And there's a huge spike, as you can see, in the cases, but that was very much due to how they were reporting cases and a change in that. But as you'll notice, that occupancy has started to tick up. And if we could just advance the slide, please, you'll see that in the last couple of weeks, we've actually seen a doubling of occupancy. Now, of course, it's coming from a very, very low base, but ultimately we are starting to see some green shoots in China as those new cases subside significantly. So that's a positive. And if we advance the slide, please, again, when we look at the markets, just before, and I'll ask when to hit the animation, but many of you may be asking, well, what's the best performing market in China? And I'm sure many of you would guess that if we then hit the animation, you'll see that actually that market is Wuhan. So despite obviously being the epicenter and where the virus initiated from a medical perspective, there's been demand for hotels. And also as people have come out of hospital and gone into quarantine, government have been paying for hotels to be used. So that is one opportunity for hoteliers, obviously, in this very, very challenging time period. And then if we just hit the animation again on a slightly more light-hearted note almost, Macau is also doing quite well in comparison. So obviously, if you're willing to gamble with money, you may be willing to gamble with catching COVID-19. So if we can just move forward, I think this is, of all the slides that I'll present, probably the most powerful one, because it showcases just the sheer global reach of the crisis. Now, this is the occupancy for the week of the 9th to the 15th of March for major markets around the world. And whereas, yes, the global financial crisis was global, when we look at previous epidemics such as SARS or MERS, they were very much regionally contained. But if we look here, as I said, it is very much global. So if we can just hit the animation, we can see initially China, obviously where the epidemic started, some green shoots there. Japan and South Korea were two of the first nations to really have an impact, again, very much declining. And then if we move forward again, you'll see Italy now had the most deaths, sadly, from COVID-19, with the most significant declines. If we then hit, again, UK and US, slightly behind the curve, but as I said, this is just to the 15th of March. These numbers are going to get significantly worse. A quick shout out to the Seychelles, just -6, so that was bearing up quite well, but things, as I said, are definitely going south. And then again, if we advance forward, you'll see the African markets here. So effectively between -47% in Senegal to -33% in Ethiopia. But let's make no mistake, these numbers are going to get worse. As mentioned, it's just to the 15th of March. So if we again advance the slide, please, to look at some of those key African markets, if we had this chart live for European countries or Asia Pacific countries or Middle Eastern countries, we would see declines from the start of this time series, but we haven't seen that in Africa. So Africa was slightly later to be heavily impacted by COVID-19. But as you can see, that most recent week, which I just showed on the previous slide, significant declines across all of the countries. And then if we advance the slide again, you'll see cities very similar, slightly later again to be impacted. But if we just pick up on some of those biggest declines across Africa, so this again, the week of the 9th of March, -57% occupancy in Cairo, and then to look at some of our, which leads the way in terms of declines. But then if we look at some of our key FIHA markets, Tunis and Casablanca both down 48%, Dakar 47%, and where we should all be this week, of course, Abidjan down 37%. So if we just advance the slide again, please, it just does showcase that same data, but just how significant some of these declines have been. But as I mentioned, these numbers will get worse as the pandemic spreads across the continent. So just to finish up, if we can advance the slides and just tab through again, please, Marla, the conclusions. So coronavirus is undoubtedly, from the data that you've seen today, having a devastating impact on our industry. And one of the main differences between this and previous epidemics is the closures that we are seeing across the industry. 40% of hotels in China were closed. We're seeing similar across Europe now, and no doubt the same will happen across the African continent as well. Of course, how long they stay closed very much depends on how the virus persists. So in terms of the forecast of looking forward, many economists, as mentioned, as you can see, they're now expecting a global recession. We can see from the data I've just presented just the sheer impact when compared to the last global recession. It is bleak. The length and depth of that, again, very much dependent on the virus and the interventions of various governments. Obviously, in Africa, that may well be more challenging than we see in the West. And the big question, of course, is travel behavior as well. How is that going to change as and when we see the recovery? But of course, moving on to that third point, we will see recovery at some point. We will bounce back. Hopefully, it won't be too long. And if it isn't too long, the second half of the year, there should be some positivity there, because ultimately, a lot of people are going to have a lot of holidays to take because nobody's taking them at present. So then there may be some green shoots there. But I think just to finish on a more human level, which I think it's important to do in the circumstances that we find ourselves in, you know, this is about looking after one another, prioritizing things you haven't managed to do, and remembering above all else, you know, this is about lives. It's not about data. It's not about hotel performance. It's not about numbers. It's about lives and maintaining them, preserving them wherever we can. So a very bleak picture in terms of hotel performance, but let's not forget the human element as we move forward. And with that, I will say thank you very much and hand back to Fabio. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Tom. Definitely some worrying signs in the stats that you've given to us, and to think that Africa is entering the winter period, so probably going to have a ramp up that's been seen in Europe. And like you say, it will be interesting to see the response from government and how the lockdowns are managed by the different countries. I think to start off with the panelists now, we'd like to give each of them 2 to 3 minutes to discuss how this has impacted their different businesses. So we're going to start with Claire. If you can give us just a brief background as to how this is affecting Proparco's performance in the region.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you to everyone. So when it comes to Proparco, we are currently in close connection with all our clients in the hospitality sector for sure, and in other sectors we've been supporting so far, so that to screen with them and have an updated understanding on how they are impacted, the difficulties they are facing, and to what extent we can help them and build an adapted strategy to help them going through that crisis. So depending on sectors, impacts are quite different, but broadly speaking, tourism industry and tourism clients in Africa are the most seriously hit, and the situation is changing every day, is going worse every day as the virus is impact is growing, and as governments are taking decisions to face the situation. So as of today, the role of the DFIs, such as Proparco, is to make sure that we will be able to help our clients go through that crisis through various measures. We are building them on a daily basis, because we are more used to provide debt instruments for long-term projects. Our instruction periods are quite long, so we are not used to be that flexible in terms of providing a quick response. But our role today is to be able to provide quickly an adapted strategy and adapted ways, so that to support our clients which are facing a real hard time in that situation. So coordination with clients and between DFIs and with local banks as well will be essential in the coming days and months to go through that crisis.
Great, thank you for that, Claire. Appreciate the background. I think, Christopher, in a very similar situation with the West African Development Bank, if you can give us a brief background onto how it's impacting you guys.
Thank you, Fabio. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all the participants too. As Claire said, it's a very serious situation. At West African Development Bank, we are currently working to see in which way we can give some support to our clients. But definitely bankers have to be flexible in that kind of situation, because tourism and hospitality industry are the most hit around the world. And we definitely have to be smooth in the approach we have towards this industry. For example, we are supposed to have our board meeting in the next few days, but for this consideration, it has been cancelled. So we are all working remotely. I'm currently at home working, so can imagine the situation. But definitely, I think one of the major, let's say, impact we see is uncertainty, because the fact that we don't know the length of that crisis is difficult to model, let's say, everything. But let's say, on the pure financial side, we will definitely need to work and see the impact and how much or how, in which way we can help our hospitality clients to, let's say, to be hit the less possible, if I can say that. So the position is quite the same as Claire. We see that all the drop in airline in the traffic, and the fact that most of the hotels around mainly the West African region in which I live are, let's say, quite closed. So we will see the impact in the next few months, but we definitely have to give a strong answer to that. Hopefully, the central bank in the region has given some positive sign by giving a 25 billion CFA. So I can give the amount in I think it's around. I can give the amount in euros after, but to the West African Development Bank to help governments to see in which way they can support different industries. Is not directly toward the tourism and hospitality industry, but we can see in which way we can use that support to help our clients. So I think in the next few months we will define a clear strategy to see in which way our clients in the region will have a help or a support from the West African Development Bank. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Christopher, for that. I think, talking about West Africa, I think from a regional point of view, there's probably no one better than Mossadegh Bali, who's the CEO of the Azalai Hotels Group. Has been doing this for about 26 years, if I'm not mistaken. So would have probably gone through a few of these, not, I would say, pandemic, but definitely some regional epidemics, as well as 2008 financial crisis. It would be interesting to get your view on this, Mossadegh.
Excuse me, but Mr. Bali is not here yet. I'm really sorry for the audience and for the colleagues. He'll be back in maybe 10 minutes. If you don't mind to pass over the phone to someone else, the time he'll join. Thank you, and I'm sorry again.
No problem. We'll join Mossadegh in about 10 minutes. Just let us know, and we'll relay some of the questions to him. Olaf, from an IFC point of view, I think the first few callers very much finance driven, but would you say that the impact has been different to yourself, from Claire and Christopher, or very much the same?
Thank you so much, Fabio, and welcome everybody. I mean, as you said, right, and as also Thomas, I think, highlighted very clearly, right, it's moving extremely fast. It's unclear yet to exactly know what will be the impact. I think different segments of the tourism industry will have different impacts between business and leisure and MICE segments, for instance. But what is key, and there I fully agree with my predecessors, that we need to move fast. That is the one impediment here in this pandemic. Now, what is perhaps to be added, what the World Bank Group has done, and some might have seen a press announcement around it, we approved a $14 billion package to work on the COVID-19 pandemic across the World Bank Group. The majority of this funding will actually is expected to be directed to the private sector. So I think that gives a big testimony of how we think about the private sector and how it will be most likely affected. Some of it already happened, as we have seen in occupancy rates, for instance. So 8 billion of the 14 billion, just to sketch that out a little bit, is expected to be given through IFC to the private sector. There will be different windows. A significant portion will be in trade finance facilitation and short-term facilities that we can that we hope to channel through commercial local banks to SMEs, for instance, which will be quite severely affected, we think. And there is also a $2 billion window that we will use for the real sector, and that entails, amongst others, of course, the tourism industry. And here we will focus in the beginning particularly on existing clients, so clients who we kind of know, we have a better understanding, and trying to assess what the situation is and how to support them during that crisis. I think as the crisis unfolds, and I think the verdict is out, how long it will be and what will be the impact on the different businesses, we have to see how we can add additional support. But in the beginning, that will be our focus. And we do have quite a few clients across Africa in this segment who we hope to support through that facility, amongst others. I will pause there, Fabio. Thanks.
Great, Olaf, thank you for that. I think lastly, Olivier, who has been in our core since different stables since 1999, and has probably got quite a lot of operational experience now with Kasada Capital Management. Will be interesting to get your take on the situation. Over to you, Olivier.
Thank you, Fabio, and good afternoon to everyone. The way we look at it is three different types of crises at the same time. Of course, the COVID-19, Thomas has presented the number, 50% decrease in RevPAR, and we know that every day is going worse and worse. But it's not only number, it's people will die, hotel will close, people will lose their job. As a reminder, hospitality industry is the first employer worldwide. So there is this crisis, there is a lack of visibility. But if we look at number Africa, all the discussion, is it a U shape, is it a V shape, we have to take into consideration two additional factors. First of all, this is the oil crisis. I'm not sure who can be the winner between Saudi and Russia on the oil battle at the moment. What is sure is that all the large oil exporters in Africa will suffer a lot. So at the moment, Nigeria, a lot of discussion around potential impact on the currency. So this will have a mid and long-term impact on some of the largest economies in Africa. And third point, everywhere in the world, we are talking about package, 10%, 30, 50% of the GDP to support the people and to help to pass the crisis. This is not the case in Africa at the moment. And this is a big issue. So what does it mean? Well, for Kasada, it means that all the deals, all the long discussion we had, the number of partners, the money that we spent, the time, everything that was valid 2-3 weeks ago has to be reassessed. But that's one point. We live with that. The other point is that what we have to deal with is unprecedented situation. Unprecedented situation means coordination, new solution, more solidarity. And at least if we can have a good news, I believe that what has been just expressed by Claire, how they can provide solution, Christopher, Olaf, your package, 8 billion for private sector. If a part of that can go to the hospitality industry in Africa, this is needed, and Kasada, if we can do everything to help and support, we'll be more than happy to do it. Thank you. Fabio, I give you back the floor.
Thank you for that, Olivier. Definitely insightful. And I think one of these situations that has almost gone under the radar is, in fact, the oil price war between Russia and the Saudis, which has had a big impact on Africa, especially the likes of Nigeria, which is a large country. I think the performance can be noted on that. And, you know, not only are we dealing with COVID-19, but we're also dealing with this crisis, which is very well noted. Out of interest's sake, the Q&A tab is now, it has been available since the start. It will be very good to get your questions for everyone that's participating or listening in on this. So I suppose where to from here? I think, you know, one of the big questions that a lot of people in the industry have asked is this pandemic, is it a catalyst for societal and real estate change? Things like remote working from home, assisting with webinars for conferences like we're doing. I think, Tom, with the research that you've done, maybe you've seen some change in this aspect in the hospitality industry.
Well, it's not a data point that we necessarily, or that we collect. I think obviously it could have an impact. One of the first things that we saw as an industry was the cancellation of events, was the travel bans that were put in place by corporates, and that had an immediate impact. I mean, here in Europe, if you look at Germany and some of the fair cities, you can see very, very clearly the impact of these kind of restrictions. So if that does have a long-term impact on the way we work, if we do more webinars, if there is more home working and less corporate travel as such, of course that will have an impact on the industry. But I still think, you know, we were talking about, you know, the fact that you could do a video call and that would eradicate the need for face-to-face, and that just simply hasn't materialized, and the benefit of conferences such as FIHA are still significant. So I would certainly hope for the hospitality industry that it's not a long-term trend that we will see downward pressure on performance as a result once we do recover from this.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think you know, definitely going to be important to discuss the operations of hotels. You mentioned specifically on the conferencing business. It's going to be the most immediate impact felt for sure from the epidemic. Olivier, maybe, you know, with your experience at Accor, you know, in terms of international brands dealing with this, how would you see this playing out in terms of owners' concessions, budgeting for future performances, things like that?
Yeah, you had a number of announcements that have been made on the last days by all the large hotel operators, number of measures taken in their organization. I strongly believe that in such circumstances, what usually we are used to say on conference about alignment of interest, I mean, is something which is even more important. So this is a crisis. This is a very severe one. This, I'm afraid, we have to be ready for a certain period of time. So how banks, hotel owners, hotel operators, unions, local authorities can work together to find solution and pass the crisis is, I think, a very important test. And that's the situation that we have to face. So there is, again, in Europe, in Asia, in US, you have a number of support that can exist. What do you do with all your employees? You close the hotel. Sometimes you have some very drastic measures to take. Here in Africa, we don't have yet such solution in place. And we all know that this is on the basis of a number of hotel owners that were already suffering prior to the crisis. So the situation here is different. The situation is more severe, and there is, I strongly believe, an urgent need for action in order to find between different market players the way to coordinate and propose some solution, but propose some solution which can be active and implemented in a very fast and efficient manner.
Yeah, Thanks for that, Olivier. And just out of interest's sake, you know, because you've spent a lot of time on the operational side, if we take it a step back from a investment point of view, I think liquidity in many African countries are going to be affected, especially in the short term. What impact do you think that's going to have from new acquisitions or from developments, whether it be greenfield or brownfield? Is it a question of delaying it from your side? Would you look at cancelling or maybe ramping up on any opportunistic acquisitions because of the impact that it's going to have on certain owners?
I would certainly not use the word opportunistic. I mean, look at what is happening, the health situation. So it's not a question of opportunity, because from a moral perspective, that it doesn't make sense. And on the top of that, with what we explained regarding the different level of crisis, the view that this is something where if there is an investor, he will benefit from a discount on the price, and then in a few weeks or few months, everything is over. I think that that's something which is not relevant at all. So the approach has to be totally different. As far as we are concerned, yeah, we have not invested yet. This is obviously a new world and new landscape. We have the benefit of the support of two strong co-investors, being Accor and being Qatar, with Qatar Hospitality and Sovereign Fund of Qatar. And our co-investors have a long-term and strategic view on Africa. So I think that everything that was said before, that Kasada is quite unique and has to play a role in the market to facilitate between local owner, investor, and financial institution. I think that in such period, this is even more accurate.
Okay. Mentioning that, Christopher, I'm going to direct this question to you. From a funder, the bank's point of view, in situations like this, where do you see, assistance for hotel owners? That's the first question that we probably need to ask. And the second would be from a working capital perspective. Is it a situation that you would look at assisting clients and operators on both elements? And how would you guys deal with this? Is it a question of a moratorium or refinancing, or the bank, for example, taking equity into a property, for example?
Thank you, Fabio. But I will answer to the last question. We mainly don't do equity. We invested in equity, but in different sectors, and not in the hospitality industry. But from I can answer from, let's say, a banking perspective, not specifically from the West African Development Bank, because we are currently analyzing the different impacts on our portfolios on different industry we have invested in. But from a banker perspective, what I can say is that we clearly see the impact on the performance of hotels and other tourism facilities. Less performance means that less occupancy rates, means less cash flows. So there's clearly an impact on the capacity to face the financial obligations. So in my introduction, I've mentioned that bankers need to be flexible because it will be in the interest of everyone in that kind of situation. So what I can say right now is that we clearly need to possibly see a moratorium, or how we can, let's say, restructure some debt because of the fact that everything is unclear and we don't know the length of that crisis, and it will clearly impact this year. So there's clearly something to be done on the financial, on the financial side. So our clients should not be afraid. They must be reassured. But what we can do, maybe we work closely with commercial banks, and we can assess the possibility to let's say how hotel managers can with, let's say, the West African Development Bank support benefit from short-term credit lines, or how they can just let's say to manage the impact of the crisis in the short period of time. So it's very difficult to answer right now directly to see and tell everyone that from a banking perspective, everything will be okay, and we will manage to see a moratorium for 1 year or something like that. Today it's very difficult to say that, because banks are, banks have regulatory requirements. So if there's some provisions that have to be made, we need to assess and see in which way this will impact our portfolio. So there will be an answer, but today I think the uncertainty of the situation left us. Let's say we have to move fast, but we have to also take measured risk in that kind of situation. I don't know if I answered your question well, but I can assist if there's some points to be clear.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We've got some more direct questions in the Q&A, which we'll get to in the last 15 minutes of the webinar. But on the back of that, being with IFC since 2003, you would have seen the crisis in 2008. What's IFC's stance in terms of owners approaching IFC in situations like this? Have they come and discussed their concerns around cash flow, and what's the flexibility like? I know that you mentioned the 2 billion, which is announced for Africa. It's not just for the hospitality sector, but it will be made available. What's your view on this and the flexibility of assisting hotel owners in this time?
Yeah, thank you so much, Fabio. And I mean, our role and mission is in a way also to be counter-cyclical, right? So given that we try to help with the development of economies. So therefore, I mean, when I look back at the present crisis from which we can perhaps learn also, there is certainly a willingness to engage and listen. And I think then what is a fundamental advantage of DFIs in perhaps this context is the very long-term view that we have, right? So when we provide financing to hotels, typically it's a 10 to 12-year time span, which is often required, right? When there are macro crises during that period or other challenges. Now, of course, as we discussed earlier, this type of COVID-19, nobody knows exactly what the impact will be. The numbers that Thomas shared, I mean, they're quite stark in terms of occupancy. I think so far not that many have yet reached out because I think in terms of working capital management, there was probably some buffer in the system, but I would expect that we will see more to come, and probably quickly, given the occupancy impact that we will see across the continent. And then it will be a matter of, again, reacting quickly. Now, as Christopher also said, I mean, it needs to be somewhat measured. And therefore, when I mentioned earlier the $2 billion real sector facility, which is across different sectors, is actually globally active, can also be used in other regions. The key focus in the beginning will be with existing clients. And that is not just by, kind of coincidence. It is those partners of ours we know the best. And I think assessing them and understanding what is fundamental, let's say, business risk and a business challenge versus temporary due to the crisis is easier than with new clients, right? Because there you need to establish a new basis and understand really the business model, how they operate in the market, etc. But it doesn't mean that we don't look at them. I mean, we continue to finance new clients too, and have been doing that quite actively in Africa in the past years. So therefore, I think, I mean, the key is really to understand what is the fundamental long-term prospect of a hotel business of a given client, and then see how we can provide financing. In terms of IFC, generally speaking, we are very flexible when it comes to instruments. But I think the key here is the maturity aspect. I mean, to really provide for long kind of maturities that allow to level out basically the repayment of, if it's debt, the debt repayment. Thanks, Fabio.
Thanks, Olaf. And then finally, before we get to the Q&A, Claire, I'd like to ask you a question around existing developments that have come across your desk for financing. How are you approaching this, either developments that are currently underway for completion in the next 12 to 24 months or new applications? You know, not knowing what the timeline of this COVID-19 crisis looks like in Africa, and going into the winter season, we don't know how long it's going to last, as well as governments, you know, different government responses to it. How would you view development applications coming across your desk or stuff that you've already got in the pipeline?
Thank you, Fabio. So when it comes to new or ongoing developments, as Olaf said, as the FIs, we are basically contracyclical and we have a long-term view. This enables us to keep on working on new developments, on new projects, and keep on supporting our clients on such projects, even in those troubled times. Even if those projects might take longer than planned to come out, so we are patient, and this is the way we are used to working. So we will keep on working on new projects and having a look at ongoing provisions. That said, the urgent matter for us is to bring solutions for existing clients which are facing very hard time given the crisis. So we need to be very reactive on that, and this is our top priority for the time being. Also, it's work in progress, but we are looking at we are taking a two steps approach actually. First is to reduce the burden on those clients and look at moratorium, as Christopher said, look at moratorium for the very next installments, for instance. So we are looking at this as a first step and on a urgent basis. And secondly, when we have a more precise view on the impact and when we have more when we are able to look at forecasts as a second step, look at how we can restructure for the long term, restructure the loans and bring other means of support. It could be short-term facilities or maybe trade financing. We are looking at every solutions that could be a good answer to those clients. Thank you, Fabio.
Great response, Claire. Thank you very much. I think we're going to open it up now for some Q&A, which has been coming through. I just wanted to check if Mossadegh has joined us on the call.
Really sorry, he's apologizing. He couldn't make it. He had an emergency, so he couldn't get along with you. Sorry that. But if you have any kind of other question, gentlemen, you can ask him or the company.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get started then. I think you know, some of the questions that we're getting now coming out is definitely around. I think Tom, maybe you could give us an answer on this. What the learnings are from Europe, and you know, what the future planning would be to you know, to safeguard against a crisis like this. You know, looking at the stats that have come out of Europe and Asia, you know, what is the kind of learnings, and also do you have a sense of how long the recovery would be if you had to compare it to 2018 financial crisis or the SARS crisis, for example? What would the recovery period look like? Would it be shorter or would it be longer, or dependent on region?
Okay, so there's a few bits there. I'll try and cover off as much as possible. So, I mean, in terms of learning from Asia and Europe so far, and I mean, Europe is just in the midst of it, really. The one word I keep using when I talk about it is unprecedented. And I really do feel that that is the situation. We have not seen something like this impact the hospitality industry to such an extent, at such a rate, across so many regions ever before. And really in terms of can you ever prepare for something like this? I don't necessarily think you can, because you can't foresee it. Obviously, there's travel restrictions, there's travel bans, there's lockdowns. This is totally uncharted territory for us as an industry. And even in the midst of SARS or MERS or the GFC, we didn't see hotels closing like they are today right across the world. So it really is, you know, unprecedented. That's the only word that I can really describe it with. In terms of recovery, initially a lot of people were asking, will it be a V shape? And I think there was a hope that it would be. That is potentially looking more unlikely, more because of the long-term economic impact that we're potentially going to feel. It took a number of years to recover average rate and RevPAR post the global financial crisis. So if that similarly happens, and of course that's if, I'm not an economist, I'm not making any forecasts here, but we will be looking at a longer term recovery than a V shape, which we saw pretty much as a result of SARS. Within 6 months of the pandemic being announced, 3 months later it was under control, 3 months later China had recovered. And remember, of course, it was only ever China that was really negatively impacted as a result of SARS. So I think the recovery looks to be more challenging, certainly, than that. But how long it takes depends on how long the crisis continues, how bad the virus continues to spread, and of course a government's reaction to that in terms of not only economic policy but also travel policy moving forward. So a huge number of unknowns still remain, but as I mentioned, the word unprecedented really for me is key when discussing this.
I think one of the key things that you've mentioned is the fact that a large number of hotels are actually closing. So we've got a very good question here around the reduction in supply because of the closures and the demand that might be slower for them to come back online. Is that a good thing for the African hotel industry? Claire, maybe you can give us a view on this. It will be interesting to understand, if it is a slow comeback, what does that mean for the African hotel industry?
Sorry, I was on mute. Really hard to say for the time being. What we will pay attention to, I think, with our clients is to make sure that should they make the decision to close for a while, or should they make the decision to run on a reduced basis until the crisis ends. What we will pay attention to is that they keep all means to be able to start again and to welcome new guests as soon as they come back, meaning that support them to keep the staff as much as possible, support them to keep the supply chain up and running as much as possible. So these are the angles I think we have to look at very closely, so that they are really ready and then with the best under the best conditions to welcome new clients as soon as things are going better.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Olivier, I'm going to direct this question to you. I think there's been a obviously from an operator point of view, there's a lot of pressure. And what would you say has the change been, or what would you expect from operators in terms of sales and marketing and operational focus, which would have changed? One of the examples would be, is it to refocus this year to more regional and local travel versus international travel? Or what do you think would be the scenario for international hotel operators?
I would like to give a try in these circumstances to have a more positive note on the fact that hospitality industry and tourism is a great industry. It's thousands of people fully dedicated to their job, providing services to the customer every day. We are in difficult situation, but obviously, especially, I don't know, but most of us and probably most of the participants as well are doing this video from their home and are in lockdown situations. So we all need after that to travel again, to socialize. People, hotel are place where you can sleep, but place where you meet people, you go to restaurants, you have events, so this will come again for sure. How long it will take? I mean, there is a number of answers that we don't have today. Probably yes, as per your question, there will be some lessons to learn. There will be some adjustment to be made. There will be, in the capacity to rebound, probably a need to have some strategy, more focus on the different markets. So it's not what one size fits all. Everybody is impacted at the moment. This is a worldwide crisis. I strongly believe that to be able to overcome the crisis and then to recover a normal situation, the plan will be to have very much tailor-made and adapted to the situation of each country and to the different client, to be smart and agile. There was a question from Trevor about the hospitality offer. Yes, there is a natural adjustment to have a number of projects that would be delayed, a number of capex that will have to be also delayed. That's a natural adjustment, but this will not be against the fact that markets step by step will recover if people are really focusing on the right answer and with the right financing structure. But we heard some good news today from our friends from the different banks and DFIs.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. Makes a lot of sense. I think one of the softer impacts that we haven't really spoken about is the staff. I think, as you know, besides options of shutting down rooms or wings in hotels, there's a big impact from contract workers being laid off or staff, you know, having to be let go, and that has a very big effect when staff members are supporting big families. I suppose, Olaf, just to ask you a question, with a lot of operators and owners, you know, calling on force majeure when it comes to insurance premiums, what do you think is going to be the impact from operators and owners negotiating HMAs, whether it be the likes of guarantees being voided or owners' priorities being lost? You know, do you see, are there any discussions with clients, or do you see any renegotiations on fees with operators, or are they just trying to survive for the next few months?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the verdict there is still a bit out because we still need to see. As I mentioned earlier, as of now, we haven't had massive amount of kind of operators coming forward or local investors, but I do think it will happen very soon. Generally speaking, since you mentioned insurance, I mean, it's one of the things where we, and I think the other DFIs too, have specialized in-house expertise. And I've seen that, I just give an example recently when we had the hurricane hit Mozambique. I think many of our clients were actually reasonably well positioned, given that we always insist on proper insurance to be in place. The question here is, of course, as you say, force majeure, and how can this be applied, etc. So I think that it's still early days to have a clear response. And then again, I think the key for operators and investors is really to look at the liquidity situation, right? I mean, how does the cash flow be impacted if we run a few stress test scenarios? So you mentioned, right, we saw earlier from Thomas the potential impact on occupancies, and I think that's what we are trying to do with kind of a few clients to see, okay, if that happens, how long will you not run into a liquidity situation, and reach out earlier, you know, rather than wait it out and then be at that crunch and not have a plan B in place. I think that's what I would suggest certainly to the hotel operators and investors, to use this time because time will be precious, and the impact will be rather stronger than less strong as we had earlier over the next weeks to come. And some countries, as I think Olivier also mentioned it, right? If a country goes in lockdown, I mean, the impact will be even more pronounced, given that it will impact across the whole stratosphere very immediately. Thank you, Fabio. Back to you.
Thanks, Olaf. I think we've probably got time for 2 more questions. There's been a lot of questions that have come through which we could answer on the Q&A directly. I think this will be for Christopher. One of the questions, and what we've seen in South Africa specifically, because we're going into lockdown, are hotel operators and to sell quarantine rooms, for example, and there have been in previous crises where governments have actually forced hotels to occupancy. Do you think this is a strategy for investors that you have, or clients that you've got in your books? And if you do, what do you think is going to be the impact on a long-term basis? Is it going to be a negative impact, or will it have a positive impact on cash flows for those hotels? Christopher, on to you.
It's quite a difficult question because you know, what we need actually currently from our, let's say, African governments is support. I want to say, even if it's not financial support, it's support in the way that maybe to defer some taxes, or to find a way where these operators can, let's say, to ease the pain. But I think one of the participant asked this question, and maybe I think is in Senegal, because I heard that in Senegal the government asked for some hotels to like for some quarantine room in some hotels. So the impact, I think, will in some ways be negative, but maybe it's a way for these operators to have some cash flow in the future. But I'm not sure it will come as far as they can, as far as they expected it to be, because we know that currently African governments have so much to deal with. The fact that the airline industry is down, the fact that the hotel and hospitality industry is down, the fact that the medical system is suffering from this situation. So I'm not sure of the good impact of that kind of let's say procedure, but maybe in some ways it's a give and take. So maybe governments will in some ways help the industry, or those who have in some ways helped to help to give some solutions, if I can say that. But on the shorter term, I don't see it as in a positive way.
Okay, thank you. Last question will be for Tom. I'm not sure if the data that's been collected would have been split between business hotels versus leisure. A lot of the questions that we're getting from the Q&A, as well as operators that we are talking to, is the difference of impact between the business hotels in the capital city or the primary cities. A lot of people are saying that they should recover quicker than leisure hotels that are harder, and the curve is going to be a lot longer to recovery. In other regional epidemics, if the leisure hotels have an impact, so for example in West Africa, you could have gone to Cabo Verde, and instead of going there, you would then go to Marrakesh, for example, or go to the Indian Ocean, to Mauritius, and just move the destinations. This has impacted the leisure industry significantly because of the long-haul flights that have been cancelled. Do you see a difference in recovery? And do you see a difference in impact from the results you've seen, if there's a distinction between the two that you've got?
Well, unfortunately, there's not a distinction. We don't track the difference between a leisure and a corporate traveller. I think your summary is quite apt. However, we would usually expect to see a faster recovery from a downturn in a city centre, gateway city type location. In terms of that recovery, I think a lot of it depends on, as mentioned, the travel bans and the confidence that people have to travel once this resolves itself. I think that the corporate market is more eager generally to get back on the road and start doing business than potentially the leisure traveller, who would be a little more cagey in terms of any decisions they make. So I think your synopsis is true there, and in the past we do see, yes, those gateway cities recovering more quickly as a general rule of thumb.
Okay, great. I think we've run over time. If dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, I'm pretty sure we could sit here for another hour. But having the conversations and reading everything in the papers and reading everything online, I think it's clear to see that there is a long-term recovery. There will be a bounce back. The question is when that's going to happen. But there are enough industry leaders, to have these discussions and look forward to the time that it does turn around. I think from an African perspective, we are gonna be having a lag effect to Europe. So the tough times are ahead. But I think definitely looking forward to the second half of the year when we should be entering the recovery phase. Thank you to the panelists. I'm going to hand it over to Jean. I don't think there's anything else except for the Q&A answers that we could respond to offline. But thank you everyone for joining. And Jean, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fabio, and thank you very much to all our panelists for taking part today and for your contributions. If I could, a big virtual round of applause for everyone for contributing to this session. We will be keeping a regular review, a regular series of this webinar, and dates will be announced for the next one soon as we keep monitoring the situation. And we may have a more regional perspective as well on future sessions looking at East Africa, North Africa, West Africa, South Africa, impacts on those specific markets in maybe a bit more detail. For all of the questions that have been submitted, thank you so very much. I mean, we have around about 30 fantastic questions to go through. These will be circulated amongst our panelists and where we haven't been able to answer them through the course of this session, and we will come back to you with a response to those questions, so please don't feel that they have been wasted. I would also like to remind you that a recorded version of this will be made available to those who have registered for the session, and also it will be made, a recorded version will be made available on social media channels. A report will be drawn up summarizing the key themes and topics around this session, and just an overview of the participants that took part, which will also be made available and translated in French as the FIHA is a bilingual event in English and French, so that will be done over the coming days. Again, thank you very much. Remember, the dates that we have currently on hold are the 7th to 9th of July, hopefully when that recovery picks up. And obviously, please keep in touch and keep posted. Keep your eyes posted on the developments on our website as well. Thank you very much, everyone, and wishing you a good evening. Cheerio. Bye.
Thank you.